In the previous year, we focused on this series of questions that Rabbi Yirmia asked, and now we're going to look at the same material by using some graphics and some flowcharts to make sure that we understand the material properly. Rabbi Yirmia was trying to get us to look at Kav B'Arba Amos, which the Gemara said is the standard, is the rule that we use to decide in a threshing place if the finder can keep that grain or not. So he's asking what exactly is this measuring? Because we know that on the one hand there's an amount of volume, that's a kav, which is again it's about 2.5 pints of grain, but there's also an area. So is this primarily measuring the area, which means is mostly focusing on the work involved? Or is it more important the value that's lying in that area? And because the value is only a kav, that's why we assume that the finder will not return. Or do we say that is it because it's Arba Amos and the area is too large and therefore the effort does not justify the effort? So there are two ways of looking at this. And this is why there is a series of questions. So on the one hand, is it because of the value is not enough? Or is it because the work is too high? And either way, the owner will not come back. So if we focus, for example, on the value, then look at the case of Chatzi Kav B'Arba Amos. How does Chatzi Kav B'Arba Amos compare to Kav B'Arba Amos? It is half of the volume, meaning half of the value, but it's also half the area, which means it's half the work. So if we look at it from the perspective of the value, well, it's less value and therefore the owner is not expected to come back. If the owner is not likely to come back, that means that the finder of this grain is allowed to keep the grain. But on the other hand, if we look at Chatzi Kav B'Arba Amos in comparison to Kav B'Arba Amos from the perspective of it is work, well, how does Chatzi Kav compare to Kav B'Arba Amos? Well, it's less work, it's half the area. It's less work, it's a small area. If we look at it from the perspective of work, then we should assume that the owner would return because it's a little bit of work. And therefore, if the owner is likely to come back, then this is the conclusion that we should reach. Well, if it's less work, then we cannot keep the grain because he's going to come back. On the other hand, if we look at it from the perspective of the value is in Chatzi Kav is half of a kav, therefore the owner will not come back and therefore the finder should be able to keep the grain. So this flow chart is similar for all the other cases. Instead of Chatzi Kav, we're going to substitute, for example, well, what happens if it's 2 kavim in 8 amos? And again, we're going to be comparing always to the case of Kav B'Arba Amos. Is it value or is it work? And depending on how we look, we follow the logic. If it's less value, that's what's going to happen. If it's more value, then he should not be able to keep it. If we increase the area, that means that it's more work, and therefore he should be able to keep it. Let's look at another set of diagrams. Okay, here we have the 4 cases that Rabbi Yirmia was asking about. The first case is Chatzi Kav B'Shtei Amos, half a kav in 2 amos, which is half the value and half the work. Then we have the case of Kavayim, 2 kavim, double the value, but Shmone Amot, double the work. Then we had the third case, which is Kav Shum Shemin, which is 1 kav of sesame seeds, which is more value. Sesame seeds are more expensive than wheat. But on the other hand, it's also more work because sesame seeds are much, much smaller than kernels of wheat. Then the last case was Kav Tambre and Kav Rimoni, a kav of dates and a kav of pomegranates. Here the work is less because these are larger, much larger than kernels of wheat. So the work is much less, but on the other hand, these are also very common fruits and therefore they're less expensive than wheat. So these are the factors. So on this column, we're going to be always doing the comparison with the case of Kav B'Arba Amos, because Kav B'Arba Amos was the case mentioned by the Gemara as being the standard. If it's a kav bi-arba amos, the Gemara told us that you can keep it. So therefore, in order to decide what the din is for chatzi kav b'shtei amos, we have to compare it to kav bi-arba amos. And the problem is that there are two ways to look at kav bi-arba amos. Do we look at it as a measurement of effort, tircha, or do we look at the chashivus, the value involved? So this is what happens. If we look at it from tircha, from the perspective of work, well, it's less work, because the areas in chatzi kav b'shtei amos is much less. If we look at the work involved, then we cannot keep the chatzi kav b'shtei amos, because we should figure out the owner will likely come back. On the other hand, if we look at it from the perspective of chashivus, of value, well, chatzi kav is half the value, and therefore the finder should be able to keep it, because less value means that the owner is not likely to come back. Now let's look at the next case. And again, we're going to compare the case of kavayim b'shmona amos to the case of kav bi-arba amos. Kavayim is 2 kavim in 8 amos. So again, if we look at it from kav bi-arba amos as a measurement of work, well, kavayim b'shmona amos is a lot more work. The area is double. And therefore, the finder should be able to keep it, because the owner is not likely to come back and work so much. But on the other hand, if we look at kav bi-arba amos from the perspective of chashivus, of value, well, kavayim is double the value. If it's more value, then we should think that the owner will likely come back, and therefore the fruit is not abandoned and the finder cannot keep it. Next case, the same pattern. Kav shum shemin. Now we're going to look at the case of a kav of sesame seeds, and we're going to compare that to kav bi-arba amos. If we look at a perspective of tircha, that kav bi-arba amos is telling us it's an amount of work, well, shum shemin, sesame seeds, are a lot more work, more difficult to pick up, and therefore the finder should assume that the owner will not come back to pick up the seeds. It's too much work, and therefore he can keep it. But if we look at kav bi-arba amos as a measurement of chashivus, of value, then we should think that kav shum shemin, the owner will likely come back, because shum shemim are much more expensive than wheat, and therefore if the owner will come back, the finder cannot keep it. And finally, let's compare the case of kav tamre, kav of dates, or a kav of rimonim, of pomegranates, and compare it to kav bi-arba amos, which is our standard. So if we look at it from the perspective of tircha, that kav bi-arba amos is measuring amount of work, well, dates and pomegranates is much less work. It's easier to pick up. These are larger fruit. If it's less work, then the owner is expected to come back, and therefore the finder cannot keep it. On the other hand, if we look at kav bi-arba amos as a measurement of value, the value is what determines whether the owner is expected to come back or not, then kav tamri, kav rimoni, pomegranates and dates, they're less value. These are cheaper fruit, and therefore the finder should think that the owner is not likely to come back, and therefore he should be able to keep the fruit. And you remember that this is such a balanced question, that both of these possibilities are so even. It makes sense to look at kav bi-arba amos as a measurement of work, but it makes equal sense to look at kav bi-arba amos as a measurement of value. And therefore the Gemara came to the conclusion, the answer was teiku, that the question stands. The Gemara couldn't decide which of these two factors is the main factor in determining why a kav bi-arba amos is the finders. So teiku means the question stands. That's what the word literally means. But there are those who explain that teiku is also an abbreviation. The tav stands for tishbi, the yud stands for itaretz, and the kuf stands for kushios, and the vav ubayos, which means the tishbi, the person who's called a tishbi, which is Eliyahu Navi, Eliyahu Tishbi, Eliyahu, he will answer kushios, difficulties, ubayos, and questions. Because part of the job of Eliyahu Navi, when he meets Hashem, he will come, is he will help us resolve these questions of the Gemara that do remain unanswered. Periodically, the Gemara has questions that it cannot come to a decision, because the question is, both options are very logical, and the Gemara could not determine which is more logical, couldn't find a proof to decide between the two, and therefore the question remains.